A man is ready to buy something small. Nothing special. A simple order. He scrolls. Clicks. Adds to cart. The total shows $19.99. Then he reaches the final step. Shipping, $6.99. He pauses. It's not the money. It's the feeling. Something about paying almost 40% extra just to receive what he already chose. Doesn't sit right. He doesn't complain. He doesn't analyze it. He just closes the tab. And forgets about it. Not because he changed his mind. But because the system made the decision for him. Now multiply that moment. Not once. Not twice. But millions of times a day across the internet. Every abandoned cart is the same invisible story. A buyer who wanted something. But lost it at the final second. Now here's what nobody noticed at the time. That lost sale problem was actually something much bigger. It wasn't a checkout issue. It wasn't even a pricing issue. It was a human behavior flaw in online shopping itself. And one company realized something dangerous. If you could remove that final moment of hesitation, you wouldn't just increase sales. You would change how people think before they buy. That company was Amazon. And in 2005, it made a decision that looked irrational. Even reckless. A decision that would quietly cost billions before anyone understood what it was building. They called it Prime. But internally, it wasn't a product. It was a bet. A bet that if shopping became effortless enough, people would stop shopping altogether. They would just buy. Before Amazon Prime existed, online shopping was not convenient. It was conditional. Every purchase carried hidden resistance. Not because people didn't want the product, but because the process kept reminding them it was a decision. You didn't just click, buy. You negotiated with the purchase. Price. Delivery time. Shipping fee. Return uncertainty. Every layer added a question. And every question gave the brain permission to hesitate. That hesitation became a pattern. People didn't abandon products because they changed their mind. They abandoned them because the moment of commitment stretched too long. Amazon saw this clearly. Not as customer behavior, but as system failure. Because from Amazon's perspective, something strange was happening. The product was already sold in the customer's mind. But the experience kept interrupting the decision before it could complete itself. So Bezos and his team started asking a different kind of question. Not, how do we sell more products? But, how do we remove the moment where people stop trusting their own decision? That question changed everything. Because the answer was not faster ads. Not cheaper products. Not better marketing. It was something far more radical. Remove friction so completely that buying no longer feels like a transaction. It feels like continuity. But there was a problem. A massive one. Shipping cost real money. Warehouses cost real money. Speed cost real money. And what Amazon was proposing was simple on paper, but terrifying in reality. Let customers pay once. And remove the visible cost of delivery entirely. Not because delivery became free, but because the customer would no longer feel it every time. On paper, it looked like financial confusion. If customers ordered more, Amazon would lose more. If Prime succeeded, costs would explode. If it failed, it would become one of the most expensive experiments in retail history. Most companies avoid decisions like this, because they are built to protect today's profit. Amazon wasn't. It was built to reshape tomorrow's behavior. And that difference is where the entire story of Prime begins. Because what looked like a shipping program was actually a quiet attempt to rewire how humans make buying decisions. And once that system started working, retail would never feel the same again. The biggest mistake people make when studying Amazon is thinking it won through retail strategy. It didn't. It won through behavioral design. And once behavior changes, competition stops being about companies. It becomes about human habit. And habits are the hardest systems to break in business. Every empire has a turning point. This was Amazon's. Until next time, keep questioning the stories behind success. By the time Prime became normal, something irreversible had already happened. People no longer described Amazon as a website. They didn't say, "I bought this online." They said, "I got it on Amazon." That language matters, because it shows identity replacement. Amazon stopped being a place you visit and became a place you default to. And once a system becomes a default, it stops competing like a business. It starts behaving like infrastructure. Shipping was only the visible layer. Underneath, Prime was quietly building something more powerful. A behavioral rhythm. A rhythm where wanting something and receiving it became almost immediate. Not always instant, but predictable enough that waiting felt temporary, not structural. And that predictability changed consumption itself. Because uncertainty is what slows buying. And Prime removed uncertainty from the experience. Prime didn't just change Amazon. It changed what people expect from every company. Today, customers don't compare just price. They compare experience. How fast? How easy? How smooth? How little effort? And once experience becomes the metric, price loses its dominance in the moment of decision. Not in theory, but in real-time behavior. This is the invisible shift most industries are still adjusting to. Amazon did not win because it had the best products. It did not win because it had the lowest prices. It did not win because it advertised the most. Amazon won because it reduced the number of decisions between desire and ownership. And in modern commerce, the company that removes friction fastest wins the behavior of the customer. Not just the transaction. The behavior. Once a behavior becomes frictionless, reversing it requires friction elsewhere. That is why competitors struggle. Because to compete with Prime, you cannot just match speed. You must match expectation. And expectations are not rebuilt quickly. They are formed through repetition. Amazon spent years teaching customers a silent lesson. Waiting is optional. And once that lesson is learned, it spreads beyond Amazon. Into retail. Into logistics. Into consumer psychology itself. A system that reduced hesitation, compressed decision-making, increased purchase frequency, and redefined normal delivery expectations. But most importantly, it made convenience feel like a right, not a feature. And when customers start believing convenience is a baseline, every competitor is forced to chase something invisible. Not Amazon, but the expectation Amazon created. In hindsight, Prime was not the innovation. The innovation was realizing this. If you remove friction from enough decisions, you don't just increase sales. You change how people make decisions altogether. And once decision-making changes, industries don't evolve. They reorganize around the new behavior. That is what happened to retail. Quietly. Without headlines. Without resistance. Without a single moment people could point to and say, This is when it changed. Every empire that lasts is not built on products. It is built on behavior control loops. Make it easier to return than to leave. Make repetition more natural than reconsideration. Make the system feel like the default reality. Amazon didn't just build Prime. It built a loop so strong that leaving it feels like effort. And in modern business, effort is the most expensive currency. Prime didn't just change shipping. It changed how people value waiting. Before Prime, waiting was normal. After Prime, waiting became noticeable. And once waiting becomes noticeable, it becomes unacceptable in many situations. Not always rationally, but emotionally. That emotional shift is what most competitors fail to measure. Because retail was never only about price. It was about time perception. And Prime rewired that perception. Physical stores didn't collapse overnight. There was no single moment. No dramatic switch. Instead, something quieter happened. Small decisions started moving online. A book here. A household item there. A replacement cable. A cleaning product. Nothing dramatic. Just convenience winning small battles repeatedly. And those small battles accumulated. Until going to a store for everyday items started feeling unnecessary. Not impossible. Just inefficient. And inefficiency, over time, becomes avoidance. What Amazon achieved was not dominance through advertising. It was dominance through repetition. Once Prime membership became normal, the question changed. People stopped asking, "Where should I buy this?" And started asking, "Is this on Amazon?" That shift sounds small. But it is structurally massive. Because it moves Amazon from being a marketplace to being a reference point. A default answer inside the consumer's mind. And defaults are extremely difficult to displace. Not because competitors are weaker, but because human behavior prefers the path of least resistance. On paper, everything seemed copyable. Faster delivery. Subscription shipping. Better logistics. Even loss-leading promotions. But what couldn't be copied easily was timing. Amazon didn't introduce Prime after behavior was fully formed. It introduced Prime while behavior was still forming. That timing advantage is everything. Because habits formed at scale are not replaced by features. They are replaced only by better habits. And building better habits requires years of consistent friction removal. Not campaigns. Not discounts. System-level redesign. Convenience is often celebrated as progress. But in commerce, convenience has a hidden consequence. It reduces deliberation. And reduced deliberation changes how people assign value. When buying becomes easier, choice becomes less reflective. And when choice becomes less reflective, consumption becomes more frequent. Not necessarily excessive, but definitely more automatic. And that automation is what reshaped retail. Not a single innovation, but thousands of micro-decisions that became easier to make. At a certain point, Amazon was no longer in competition with local retailers. Because local retailers were still competing on price, location, product availability. But Amazon had already shifted the battlefield. It was competing on effortlessness, predictability, habit formation. And those are not retail metrics. Those are behavioral metrics. Which means traditional retail comparisons no longer applied. What started as a shipping experiment became a redefinition of expectation. People didn't just want fast delivery anymore. They expected it. And once expectation changes, everything below it feels outdated. Not because it is worse, but because it no longer matches the new baseline. And Amazon didn't just meet that baseline. It raised it. Quietly. At some point, Prime stopped looking like a product. And started behaving like a system that learns from its own success. Because every time a customer used it, something important happened inside Amazon's ecosystem. It wasn't that people bought more. It's that they thought less before buying. Not in a careless way, but in a normalized way. Small purchases became almost unconscious. Replacement items became automatic. Impulse items no longer required justification. And slowly, Amazon stopped being a store. It became a default system in the background of daily life. Not a destination. A habit. And habits do not behave like markets. They behave like reflexes. Most people misunderstood Prime as a shipping service. But internally, it functioned differently. It was a behavioral shortcut. A way to compress thought. Before Prime. Desire, comparison, hesitation, purchase or exit. After Prime. Desire, purchase. That missing middle step is everything. Because that middle step is where doubt lives. It is where alternatives are considered. It is where delays begin. And Amazon didn't eliminate doubt by persuasion. It eliminated the need to confront it. This is why Prime was never just logistics. It was psychology delivered through infrastructure. Something subtle began to happen after Prime entered everyday life. At first, nobody called it a change in behavior. People just said it was convenient. That was the surface explanation. But underneath it, something deeper was shifting. The act of buying started losing its weight. Not because products became cheaper, but because the mental process around buying started disappearing. There was a time when every online purchase carried a small internal debate. Do I really need this? Is this the best price? Will it arrive on time? Should I check somewhere else first? Prime quietly removed most of those questions. Not by answering them, but by making them unnecessary. Because once shipping stops being a variable, comparison shopping loses one of its strongest reasons to exist. And without comparison, decision-making becomes faster. Almost automatic. At first, Prime looked like a bold experiment in logistics. A risky bet on faster shipping. A questionable financial trade-off. A program that seemed designed to lose money in exchange for growth. But beneath the surface, something far more important was happening. Amazon was no longer competing on price. It was competing on friction elimination. And friction elimination has one outcome. Once people experience it, they don't want to go back. Because the real product was never shipping. It was certainty. No waiting. No comparison loops. No hesitation. Just action. And once that behavior became normal, the rules of retail stopped applying in the same way. What looked like a membership program was actually the beginning of a behavioral lock-in system that would reshape global commerce. But even Amazon had not yet fully seen what it had created. Because the real impact of Prime was not measured in deliveries. It was measured in something far more dangerous. Human expectation. What made Prime powerful was not what customers saw. It was what they stopped noticing. No shipping calculation. No hesitation at checkout. No emotional interruption before purchase. Just a smooth continuation from desire to ownership. And slowly, something deeper started to shift. Customers began to change their own behavior without realizing it. They didn't shop less carefully. They shopped less consciously. They didn't evaluate alternatives as often. Because the cost of trying something new felt lower. And in behavioral terms, that is the most powerful transformation in commerce. When effort disappears, comparison disappears with it. Amazon had not just improved delivery. It had removed the pause between thought and purchase. And in that pause, most buying decisions used to live. To investors, Prime looked like a contradiction. A company already struggling with thin margins was now encouraging people to order more frequently, while reducing the visible cost per transaction. Analysts saw risk everywhere. Higher shipping volume, higher fulfillment strain, higher operational cost, lower short-term profitability. And they asked a logical question. How does this make financial sense? But that question missed the point entirely. Because Bezos wasn't playing the short-term profit game. He was building something closer to infrastructure than retail. Something that would eventually change how people behave, not just how they buy. And that's where the misunderstanding deepened. Wall Street saw a shipping discount program. Amazon saw a habit-forming system. Because once a customer stopped thinking about shipping, they stopped comparing prices. And once they stopped comparing prices, they stopped behaving like traditional shoppers. They became something else entirely. Repeat participants in a system designed for convenience. Not decision makers, but reflex buyers. Inside Amazon, the idea that became Prime did not arrive as a polished product. It arrived as a question that made traditional finance people uncomfortable. What if customers didn't pay for shipping every time they ordered, but instead paid once, upfront, and stopped thinking about it completely? On the surface, it sounded simple. But underneath it, it was a direct attack on how retail had always worked. Because shipping wasn't just a cost. It was one of the last visible reminders that shopping had consequences. And Amazon was about to blur that visibility. The proposal was this: a yearly membership fee. Unlimited 2-day shipping. No per-order shipping charge. At the time, Amazon charged $79 per year. But what mattered wasn't the price. It was the behavior it triggered. Because once a customer paid that fee, something subtle happened. Every purchase suddenly felt already paid for. The friction disappeared from the moment of checkout and moved to the start of the year. And that shift changed everything. But internally, Amazon knew the truth. This was not a profit program. It was a usage accelerator. The more people used it, the more expensive it became to serve them. Heavy buyers would cost far more than $79. Occasional buyers would subsidize the system. And the math looked dangerous. So dangerous that most traditional retailers would have killed the idea immediately. But Amazon wasn't optimizing for margin per order. It was optimizing for frequency of life. How often do you come back? How often do you check? How often do you hesitate less? Because in Amazon's internal thinking, the real competition was not other stores. It was the customer's decision to delay buying at all. The biggest mistake people make when studying Amazon is thinking it won through retail strategy. It didn't. It won through behavioral design. And once behavior changes, competition stops being about companies. It becomes about human habit. And habits are the hardest systems to break in business. Every empire has a turning point. This was Amazon's. Until next time, keep questioning the stories behind success.